I've played Victoria 3 now for over 200 hours, and in that time I've come to realise that the pacing of the game may be slightly off. For starters, I want to refer to my review of the game, in which I stated that I thought that the economic side of Vicky 3 was the best they've ever done in any of their games, specifically referring to the building system. Well, my thoughts on that may have shifted in the 130 hours I've put in since I started writing that script. Don't get me wrong, I still think the building system is good, but all things must come in moderation, and the building system is pretty badly moderated, to the point where it really is the primary point of determining how successful of a country you are. The primary gameplay loop is in increasing the size of your construction sector, and building the industry to supply that construction sector with the resources it needs. Unlike Vicky 2, where you could go long periods of time without anything being built, if you're not constructing something, you're falling behind, as there's always something to build to get more resources, get more products, improve your construction, etc., etc. Tell me if this gameplay loop seems somewhat familiar. You start the game, look at your market to see what you're behind on, start constructing the buildings that alleviate that deficit. With your research, you go for the water tube boiler. When it's done, you've unlocked a bunch of new production methods, so you go into your buildings tab to change your mines and workshops to use the water tube boiler. Now your buildings use more coal, so you alt-click some coal mines to bump them to the front of the queue to cover the increased demand. Choose another tech, maybe intensive agriculture. When it's done, go back to your buildings tab, flip through the tabs and change your farms to fertilizer. Now you can build chemical plants, so you queue them up. Maybe at some point you conquer a bit of territory. Back to the buildings tab to make sure the buildings you've inherited are using the correct methods. Next tech is maybe mechanical tools. Research that, back to the buildings tab, change to utilize the new method. Next tech, new production method, build something to cover the demand. Next tech, new building, next tech, new production method, back to the buildings tab, next tech, etc., 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 etc. That loop is fine for the first few campaigns, but man, am I getting bored of it. And that is to say nothing about how weirdly some techs are placed. Electrical generation, being a tier 3 building, comes right as you're needing to increase your resource gathering to cover the demand from the upgraded production methods, meaning it's not at all uncommon for me to do nothing with this tech for some years after I've researched it. It's very rare for me to have a surplus of the steel, coal and tools that make engines cheap in my motor industries, so electricity almost invariably ends up being incredibly expensive, and to solve this problem requires shuffling around my buildings queue of other things I'm also in desperate need of. When I get dynamite, I cannot cover the cost of it in explosives, because right up until I've researched it, I have other immediate needs on my construction sector, and if you have livestock, you have enough fertilizer to not even need the chemical plant. Pump jacks and the ability to start collecting oil comes before any oil is really needed, which is probably why the AI is so shockingly bad at prioritizing building them. And the only way to solve this, or rather the only way of minimizing this problem, is to just spam a ton of construction sectors. As it is, as I previously mentioned, the only real metric of success. If your construction sector isn't the largest industry in your country, then you're doing it wrong. And I just have to believe that there's a better way here. The need to jump into the building tab every 5 minutes and check every building to see if the latest tech or conquest requires a production method change is getting really old at this point. And with the devs stating that they're considering looking at methods to increase automation, I thought I'd try my hand at coming up with a solution to this overly repetitive gameplay loop. So, the criteria that I wanted to stick to. I wanted to do away with the need to constantly have something building. It was not like this in Victoria 2, and I don't think it's healthy for Victoria 3. I like the construction sector, including its need for raw resources and its upgrade path, so I want to keep this around in some fashion. Needless busy work, like hopping into your buildings tab every time you unlock a tech, has to go. It's pure tedium. Let's start with that last one, as this is a fix that I think can be implemented even if every one of the other elements of my proposed changes are ignored. When you go to change a production method in your country, you should have the ability to make it preferred, such that any buildings you inherit through conquest or integration will automatically change to this preferred production method. Easy. Now, the meaty bit. I think you should only be able to build one level of a building manually in the way that we do it now. It will appear in your list of buildings in your construction tab, but you'd not be able to queue 50 levels like you currently are able to. But Lambert, one level is not enough. How do we get more tools if we only have a single level of tools workshops? Well, no. I'm not proposing that higher levels cannot be attained, just that it is all we can manually build with our construction sector. Instead, buildings would upgrade on their own when they have maxed out their employees and are still making a profit, just like the auto-expand does now. But instead of this expansion being put into the construction queue, it would simply be done automatically over time. It would still cost money to upgrade, depending on the ownership production method, but it would not take up a construction slot. I would also give the option to deny a factory from expanding simply with the addition of a checkbox, if the player does not wish for the factory to expand any further. I would also limit the amount of upgrading that can be done based on the production method. A logging camp, for example, with simple forestry and horse-drawn special equipment and road carts, would have very limited amount of expansion potential. But as you advance through the game and upgrade your methods to electric sawmill, chainsaws, and rail log carts, this potential expansion could go up dramatically. The benefit to this system is twofold, in my opinion. Firstly, it means that the meta of an ever-expanding construction sector is not quite so necessary, as much of the building that players are currently doing is not the first-time construction of a building, but getting those buildings up to a much higher level to take advantage of the throughput bonus. Secondly, it means that you're not so penalized for spreading out your industries throughout your nation, which certainly feels more realistic to me. Now that the construction sector isn't permanently busy, what do I do with my construction sector when it's not building anything? Why have a large construction sector anymore, or advance to the later methods? It's a valid question, and my answer to that would be to introduce some kind of maintenance into things like railways and roadways. The more spare construction capacity you have, the higher the market access will be in your states, which I believe will be somewhat necessary when larger cities are no longer capable of stacking 20 levels of railways in a single state. I think this system would lead to gameplay that isn't reduced to spamming alt-click on a building every time you're lacking in that area, and more realistic distribution of buildings, with less emphasis on stacking so heavily in specialized states. Though on this topic, there 100% should be a return of the throughput bonus for having a building's good requirement be a product in the same state. If I build steel mills and tool manufactories in Silesia, which has ample coal and iron for this process, there should be a visible and marked benefit over having the goods be transported long distances. The building system is good right now, but it's also overbearing and the majority of our gameplay is done in menus, and I think my suggestion here goes a long way to addressing that. Now, the question becomes, but this is the majority of the game. What do you do in Victoria 3 if you change buildings to be less hands-on? I'd answer that this is a pretty scathing critique of Victoria 3. That the game has little else to do other than sit in menus poring over and microing your goods balance and building queue. And like I said at the beginning of the video, in the beginning, I enjoyed this gameplay loop, and I imagine that much of the pushback I will receive from this video will be from people who still remain in that phase where they still find fun and enjoyment over clicking their market tab, sorting by balance or price, clicking the buildings menu or the awful buildings lens, queuing up a building to address the imbalance they see, then waiting for the effects of that to take hold, only to go back to step 1 and do it all over again. If you still enjoy that, then I imagine you will dislike my proposed changes, and as to what will replace it, well, Paradox have a reputation for long-term support of their titles. Even Imperator took 2 years to be abandoned. I'm sure that freeing up attention on the building micromanagement will leave the player time to focus on the fun parts of Victoria 3, when Paradox get around to implementing them. Thanks for watching. Sub to the channel and hit the bell to be notified of any future videos, blah blah blah. Till next time, bye bye.